I want to share a disturbing series of events that unfolded in my life. It's about a stalker, a mysterious threat, and the fear that enveloped my daily existence. I was working as a magazine editor in New York, a city I loved for its energy and vibrancy. My magazine focused on lifestyle and beauty, a light, inoffensive publication. Or so I thought. One evening as I walked home from work, I noticed something that shattered my sense of security. I felt eyes on me, a persistent gaze that burrowed into my back. Turning around, I caught a glimpse of a man in a black hoodie who quickly ducked into an alley when our eyes met. Disconcerted but trying to brush it off, I quickened my pace and reached home without further incident. That sense of safety was short-lived. Under my door, I found an envelope with a chilling message written in red marker. "You will pay for what you did." The words were a stark contrast to my peaceful life. I had no conflicts, no angry exes, nothing that could explain this ominous threat. Sleep eluded me that night as I racked my brain for any incident, any article that might have sparked such animosity. But nothing came to mind. My magazine was the least likely source for controversy. The following days were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. I caught fleeting glimpses of the man in the hoodie, or so I thought. I was never sure. Was I being followed, or was it my imagination, fueled by fear? Then one midnight, the phone rang, slicing through the silence of my apartment. A male voice, cold and menacing, asked, "Are you alone?" My heart raced. I demanded to know who it was, but his reply was a veiled threat before the line went dead. "You know who this is, and you will get what you deserve." The next day, my sense of dread deepened. My secretary burst into my office, her face pale with worry. She relayed a message that my mother had suffered a heart attack and was hospitalized. Panic-stricken, I rushed to the hospital, only to find that my mother wasn't there. Confused and frightened, I called her cell, and to my immense relief, she answered safe and sound at home. Realization hit me like a ton of bricks. It was all a cruel prank, orchestrated by my stalker. I reported everything to the police, but they could offer little more than logging the case. They said there wasn't enough to go on. In the weeks that followed, I never saw the man again, but the terror wasn't over. Periodically, I'd receive anonymous bouquets of flowers at home, each one a silent reminder that he was still out there, watching. The lack of any note or acknowledgement on the flowers only intensified the mystery and fear surrounding these unwanted gifts. Life became a series of looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows, and dreading anonymous phone calls. I installed extra locks, invested in a security system, but the feeling of being hunted persisted. The identity and motives of my stalker remained a mystery. Perhaps he mistook me for someone else, or maybe he was a disturbed reader whose fantasy I unwittingly became a part of. I never found out. When I was 16, I agreed to go on a blind date to a school dance. He was a friend of a friend, a guy from another school. We hit it off over the phone. He was charming, funny, and we seemed to share a lot of interest. The dance itself was fun. We laughed, danced, and I felt like I'd made a genuine connection. After the dance, we continued talking on the phone. But soon, it became clear he wasn't over his ex-girlfriend. His conversations always circled back to her, and his tone grew increasingly bitter. When he told me just before Christmas that his ideal gift would be his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend dead under his Christmas tree, I was chilled to the bone. He said it with such seriousness, such intensity, that I knew I had to distance myself. That's when things took a turn for the worse. Not taking his calls seemed to trigger something in him. He started relaying messages through our mutual friend, messages that were insulting and downright scary. But what really terrified me was that he knew where I worked. I was a cashier at a store in the mall, a job I usually loved. But he turned it into my personal hell. He'd show up with his friends, standing just outside the store, taunting and yelling things at me. I was trapped at the registers, forced to endure their harassment. I couldn't understand why my coworkers or managers never intervened. Maybe they thought it was just teenage drama, but to me, it was a living nightmare. The final straw came one afternoon at school. Our mutual friend, who I no longer considered a friend after this, delivered a message that made my blood run cold. The guy threatened to assault me. The casual way this friend relayed the threat, as if it was some kind of joke, made my stomach churn. I snapped. Standing by my locker, I turned to him and snarled, "Fuck you," with more venom than I'd ever felt in my life. The look of surprise on his face was almost satisfying, but it didn't erase the fear that had taken root in my heart. The situation took a drastic turn one evening at work. He showed up alone this time, his eyes wild and demeanor unhinged. He began screaming at me from outside the store, causing customers to stop and stare. His words were a mix of insults and pleas, a jumbled tirade that made no sense. I was frozen, trapped behind the register. But this time something snapped in him. He charged into the store, knocking over displays in a frenzied attempt to reach me. Customers screamed, running out of the store as my coworkers finally reacted, trying to intervene. It was chaos. In the midst of the panic, I managed to call the police. They arrived quickly, but not before he had caused significant damage and terrified everyone in the store. The sight of him being handcuffed and led away by the police was both a relief and a shock. The aftermath was a whirlwind of statements and questions. I learned that he had been struggling with mental health issues, exacerbated by the breakup with his ex-girlfriend. His obsession with me was a misplaced attempt to cope with his pain. The incident left deep scars. I struggled with anxiety and fear long after he was gone. I couldn't understand why I hadn't spoken up sooner, why I had allowed it to escalate to that point. I eventually left that job and started anew, but the experience stayed with me. It taught me the importance of speaking out and seeking help when facing threats or harassment. No one should ever feel they have to face such terror alone. I was 18 at the time, living in the same suburban neighborhood my whole life. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other and nothing bad ever seemed to happen. That sense of safety was shattered one ordinary afternoon. I decided to walk to the corner store just 4 blocks away to grab some snacks. The route was familiar, a 4-lane road bisected by a median, lined with residential houses. The only commercial area was a small strip of shops on my side, next to a school. A guardrail ran along the sidewalk, a barrier between pedestrians and the traffic. With my headphones in, I was changing the music when I first saw him. An old man in a beat-up gray car drove past me, and slowed down, coming to a stop in the middle of the road. He rolled down his passenger window and called out to me. He asked if I wanted to hang out. His voice had a creepy, insistent tone that set off alarm bells in my head. I declined, hoping he would just drive away, but he persisted, offering weed, trying to entice me. I refused again, my heart starting to race. He looked behind him, scanning the road, then finally drove off. Relieved but shaken, I continued walking, eager to get to the store and back home. But the ordeal wasn't over. The man made a U-turn and came back, stopping again to ask me to join him. This time he was more insistent, suggesting we go behind the nearby building. Fear gripped me. I said no, louder, more forcefully. He drove off again, but this time he didn't leave. He parked in the lot of the shops ahead, waiting for me to walk past him. I realized he wasn't going to give up easily. Adrenaline pumping, I knew I had to make a move. I couldn't walk past him. Who knew what he might do? So for the first time in my life, I jaywalked. I waited for a gap in the traffic, then dashed across the road, jumping over the guardrail on the other side. I sprinted home, not looking back, not stopping until I reached the safety of my house. I burst through the door, out of breath and terrified. I told my dad everything. We got in the car and drove back to the shop, ready to confront the man or get his license plate number. But he was gone, vanished as quickly as he had appeared. For weeks after, I was paranoid every time I left the house. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the gray car lurking around a corner. The incident shattered my perception of safety in my own neighborhood. I never saw him again, but the fear he instilled in me lingered long after. I was working as a bartender at a popular local club, a job that had its fair share of late nights and interesting encounters. The club was a vibrant place filled with all sorts of characters, but one night stands out for all the wrong reasons. It was a busy evening, the club thrumming with music and chatter. Amidst pouring drinks and flashing smiles, I noticed a guy sitting alone at the bar. He was a regular, though we'd never interacted much. That night, he decided to strike up a conversation. He seemed friendly at first, just making small talk. But as the night progressed, his demeanor changed. He began complimenting me excessively and made several attempts to ask me out. Each time I politely declined, trying to keep things professional. I could tell he wasn't pleased, but he eventually left the bar. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. Fast forward to the end of my shift. My house was a modest, single-story building in a quiet neighborhood. As I approached, nothing seemed amiss. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, ready to crash. That's when I saw him, a man from the club sitting stark naked on my couch. Shock and fear paralyzed me. The man looked up, an eerie calmness in his eyes. It was the same guy that asked me out earlier in the night. How he had found where I lived and broken in was beyond me. "Hey," he said nonchalantly, as if it were perfectly normal to be sitting naked in someone else's living room. My mind raced with panic. I backed away slowly, reaching for my phone to call the police. The man didn't move, just watched me with a chilling, unblinking stare. "I just wanted to see where you live," he said in a disturbingly casual tone. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was afraid to turn my back on him. I edged towards the kitchen, putting distance between us. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. The operator's voice was a lifeline in that moment of sheer terror. I explained the situation in hushed tones, my eyes never leaving the intruder. The man remained motionless, an unsettling smile playing on his lips. Police arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours. They entered cautiously, apprehending the intruder without incident. He didn't resist, just let out a soft chuckle as they led him away in handcuffs. The aftermath was a blur of statements and questions. I learned that the man had a history of stalking behavior, though nothing to this extent. He had somehow copied my house key one night at the club and decided to let himself in. I couldn't shake the feeling of violation, knowing a stranger had been in my home, sitting on my furniture, invading my personal space. Sleep was impossible for nights afterward. I had the locks changed and installed a security system, but the sense of safety in my own home was shattered. The incident became a topic of hushed conversation at the club. Some regulars joked about it, but to me, it was far from funny. I became cautious, distrusting, always wondering if someone else was watching me. Click on this next video if you enjoyed for more content like this, and subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps the channel.